Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, November 3rd, 2021. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, also of counsel with ComLog Group, and very exciting time right now to be involved in broadband and in the broadband infrastructure world, right? We at Broadband Breakfast are a news organization and an events community focused around better broadband, better lives. Our focus is always on not only the infrastructure, but how the infrastructure is used. And we're seeing a greater focus, I believe, on some aspects of that. We call it broadband's impact, the way broadband projects once initiated will really lead to rollout of new applications, new tools, telehealth, teleeducation, civic participation. Of course, the pandemic, which is what caused us to start doing this live weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online, is I guess, if you will, the proximate cause for a lot of the current discussion about broadband and broadband infrastructure, but obviously by no means the only reason that we've been talking about that. We also talk about the social policies and issues that come, some of the controversies we're seeing around big tech. Next week, we're going to be talking about some of those at our weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We certainly encourage all of you to stay calendared on Wednesday at 12 noon. Now, with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our two panelists. Very excited to have both Debbie Kish and Doug Dawson. Doug's been with us several times before, so thank you, Doug, for appearing again. Debbie Kish is the Vice President of Research and Workforce Development for the Fiber Broadband Association, and Doug Dawson is a consultant with CCG Consulting, but probably gets more known by or appended to the Pots and Pans blog that he does every day. I continue to be in awe, Doug, that you produce that great content every single day of business day of the week. We of course produce content every single day, but I've got other people helping me out here. So it's exciting to see the focus and the intelligent observations around broadband infrastructure, which is of course what we're going to focus on more here today. And to just a tad more context, we are seeing a lot of discussion about labor shortages, supply chains, rising costs. Inflation is a real thing. I mean, it's hard. I mean, lots of products I've ordered, from cars to computers, are back ordered, and so it's a real thing that we're experiencing. The question is, how much long-term impact will this have, and what impact will it have on broadband deployments? And indeed, many of us in the industry are just waiting for Congress to finish passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that, of course, promises $65 billion for broadband, $42 billion of which will be specifically for infrastructure deployment. So we want to talk about the supply chain issues, labor shortages, including inflation, the I word, and how that impacts these broadband deployments. So with that preface, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Deb. Tell us just a little bit more about yourself, if you don't mind, in your role at Research and Workforce Development at the Fiber Broadband Association. And then what are some of your thoughts and some of the research you're seeing about this topic right now?
Oh, sure. Thanks. So I run the research and workforce development initiatives for the Fiber Broadband Association, and I'll touch on what that means in a little bit. As far as the supply chain, it's a really big topic right now, and it certainly has hampered some service providers' fiber build-outs. For example, AT&T had planned to build out fiber to 3 million homes in 2021, but just a couple of months ago, or about when we entered the third quarter, they estimated that they would really only get to about 2.5 million. And that's largely due to supply chain issues. Now I realize that that doesn't necessarily sound like they're missing the mark by a whole lot, but when you think about it, it's still 500,000 homes. And with today's growing remote workforce, a lot of people are working from home now because of the pandemic. There's never really been a stronger need for reliable high-speed internet access. So that said, we're currently seeing three main areas of constraints in the supply chain. So one is obviously materials. So, the shortage in things like chipsets or semiconductors and other components that affect fiber broadband buildouts or just broadband in general. So service providers might find themselves looking to non-traditional suppliers where availability might be earlier and maybe in line with their projects. And vendors can do things like limit their part numbers that could lead to fewer supply failure points. Then, of course, one of the bigger topics for me is labor. So there's a significant shortage in labor. And with the new bills that you mentioned before, Drew, the government programs like RDOF and the still undecided infrastructure bill, we're still waiting on that. There's been a significant effect. We think that they'll have a significant effect on the job market. And there's other things like state initiatives that are looking to build and bring high-speed, reliable internet service to unserved and underserved areas that will ultimately close the gap in the digital divide. So we had some research recently published on how fiber broadband can close the digital divide between urban areas and rural areas. And the thing is, it takes people to connect fibers and do the installation. So we hear the need from our service provider and contractor members. Our member base is largely, it's over 50% are service providers. And we've actually been hearing from them the real need from their point of view and the desire from community colleges and veteran programs and institutions that they're looking to provide courses that bring those skilled individuals to the workforce or to the market. Now, there's a real possibility that the lack of skilled labor will maybe slow down the speed of rollouts in the future. So these programs and bills will more than likely create thousands of jobs. So to combat that, we at the Fiber Broadband Association have developed a fiber optic certification course, which I am really, really excited about. It's a comprehensive course with either an internship or an apprenticeship opportunity that will really accelerate these initiatives and projects. I could go deeper into that, but I kind of wanted to get to the third point, or the third constraint is obviously cost. Cost is, let's face it, when there's a shortage of anything, it typically drives the prices up, whether it's materials themselves or other things like freight and shipping. I mean, we see that when we go to the gas pumps ourselves. Every time I go to fill up my gas tank, it's $60. So all of these things contribute to the halting or slowing down of broadband deployment. And, it's interesting because, there's money there. So we're, again, waiting for the infrastructure bill to pass. There will be a lot of money out there. There's a lot of state initiatives going on. There's funding that is being provided by the states. And, it'll be interesting, I guess, to see when we get there and, when the spending starts happening, how much of that is going to go to materials with the rising costs and how much of that will go to things like skilled labor. So those are the things that, I'm currently sort of looking at from the Fiber Broadband Association's perspective.
Those are great points to set the table for us, and we could dive in, and we'll dive into each of those: materials, labor, cost, and its impact. But let's go ahead and broaden the discussion. Doug, tell us just a little bit more about yourself, your work at CCG, and your take on this topic.
Hi, so I'm Doug Dawson, president and the founder of CCG Consulting. We have over 1,100 clients. A really large percentage of those are ISPs. And so I'm hearing lots and lots of stories about supply chain issues. The thing that is most interesting about the supply chain is how hit and miss it is. You hear there's big backlogs in fiber. And so that turns out to be true, but just in the last week, I had one client who was able to order some ADSS cable, which is cable that goes up in the power space, and they got 14-week delivery on it. On the same order, they wanted to buy buried fiber, and that they were told 4 weeks on that. So it's not, every kind of fiber is not the same. We also were helping somebody look into doing some underwater cable, and we're told, how fast do you want the delivery? Because apparently the vendor was sitting on it and nobody had ordered it. So the supply chain is a very hit and miss thing, and so it gets to be, it's really where you are in the country and who your supplier is, because you may work with a supply house that can get it and another supply house can't. And so that the first issue is there's no predictability of what you're going to run into. I had one client who 3 weeks apart tried to buy $1 million of fiber and got a drastically different response both times. And so, so right now, you're taking your chances when you go to the computer to order something. It also extends out to, we're seeing shortages in areas that people never even thought about. I have someone who's waiting 9 months to get a piece of fiber test equipment. It's like, well, you can't really build it if you can't test it and make sure it works, right? And so, the supply chain is everything up and down the line of that we use in the broadband business. There's a big backlog right now to get portable electric generators. And so, these things, they come and they go. And the supply chain is a really complicated issue. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time this year just trying to understand what it means. And if you take any one component of it, like getting ONTs for fiber to the home, there's 20 reasons why there's a supply chain issue for an ONT. There's all sorts of reasons why the chips are a problem. There's all sorts of reasons that are affecting the housing around the ONT. There's all sorts of reasons around the shipping and warehousing of it. I mean, Amazon is running out of cardboard boxes, for Pete's sakes. I mean, the supply chain issue is really complex and it's really widespread, and it's going to take us in some places a long time to work ourselves out of it. Most of these problems will be solved over time, but we've really created this problem ourselves. 30 years ago, if we had a pandemic then, we would have had this problem, but it's going to take 5 times longer to solve it now, because what we've done is we've dispersed how we buy things. We now buy things from the whole world instead of, 35 years ago, the United States was the primary manufacturer of telecom goods. If you really had to, you'd drive to the factory yourself and pick up some spare parts, right? You can't do that when they're made in 6 different places and they have to be assembled in a 7th place. And so we've broken the supply chain up by the worldwide economy, and because of that, it's going to be really hard to put it back together. Right now we're having trouble even getting the raw materials out of the mines in Africa. You just take each one of these steps of how you make a device, and each one of those pieces has its own little story. So, so there's no real easy, and then you go to the newspaper and it goes, well, things are backed up at the port. Well, that's 1 out of 40 reasons why we're having a problem. That's not why we're having a supply chain problem. That's just one more issue. I had someone who waited 12 weeks to get some electronics out of a dock in San Diego. So, that certainly is an issue, but that's not by any means the primary issue. So we're seeing just, one thing for sure, for fiber that Debbie mentioned, the reports I'm getting are longer. When you start hearing 50 weeks, you're not, you can't build a project next year now. So the last point I want to make is it also depends on who you are. This is not a good time to be a first-time ISP who doesn't have established relationships. So, in fact, a lot of supply houses are now telling some of my clients that they're not even interested in taking them on as clients. They're not saying that directly because they want them to be their customer someday, but they're going, 1 or 2 years to get things. That's a polite way to say, I can't really help you, right? So some of these small cities are going to try to build money out of their ARPA money. They're not going to be able to at all to get in the supply chain to buy the stuff they need from it. If all they want to do is hook up, a couple of public housing units to fiber or something, they're going to be the ones at the very end of the supply chain. when AT&T has a problem, it doesn't have to go down very far downhill for the little guys to really have problems. And so it's just one of the most amazing things to watch, because we saw it coming and now it's here, and it's been like a slow motion train wreck. And unfortunately, there's still about half of the train is behind, so it hadn't finished going off the tracks yet. So, so we'll get there, I hope. So.
Well, wonderful, and again, great examples and stories that and facts that set the table for our discussion. Before we dive specifically into the microeconomics, if you will, of the fiber supply chain, I want to stick at the macro level for a moment and just to kind of underscore. I mean, and Doug, you started to get at this a little bit. I mean, obviously, globalization has brought us this benefit of easy access to the world, but when there's something, and I'm going to put three things out here. One thing is the pandemic, of course, right? I mean, and long-term shutdowns between places. Obviously, a lot of that's easy now, but there's obviously still lingering impacts. So of these three things, let's just get each of your takes, Debbie and Doug, on their role in the process that you're experiencing right now. One is the pandemic and the lingering effects of the pandemic. The other, and I just want to highlight this because this word supply chain has been used almost like a bit of a code for we've got to deal with Chinese equipment manufacturers and the whole issue of Huawei and ZTE's equipment as part of networks. And obviously that's a big topic. It's there's now funding to rip and replace this. So that's often kind of code for supply chain is often code for that issue, right? And third is just the state of the economy right now, right? And again, I don't mean to get political in the macro sense here, but we certainly are dealing with the situation where the economy appears to be heating, and yet there's a lot of money about to be spent on broadband infrastructure, on the reconciliation bill, 1.7 trillion, plus 1.2 trillion. I mean, we're looking at putting 3 trillion into the economy right now. And again, your take, both of you, Debbie and Doug, on those three impacts and how they are trickling into the world you're facing on this topic. Debbie.
So on the pandemic, I mentioned briefly before that it's more important now for America to be connected, even the world, when you think about it, because the effect that it had is, we've been talking about rural areas, and, I mentioned connecting, closing the digital divide gap, to unserved and underserved. And, it's with the spending, I'm sorry, let me go back. The work from home, there's a lot of companies that sent people home. They had to figure out, how are we going to get our employees, at home working when a lot of people didn't have, strong internet connections. And, when you think about underserved and unserved areas, those people will need to have access to things like telehealth. They need access to resources, and, not to beat the pandemic to death, but, when you think about how many resources are available online for things like CDC guidance, or, even when you're traveling, those areas need to be connected. And, fiber is the only future-proof technology that would, be able to satisfy those areas and connect those individuals to those important resources. Even tribal areas in the United States are unserved or underserved with internet.
So you're raising another wrinkle. Not only is the pandemic about, closing ports and such not, but it's about dispersing the workforce, right, into many settings, and that makes kind of just getting things done more complicated, or it can make getting things done more complicated. Doug, what are your reactions to these other 2 points about kind of China and its role in the ecosystem, and also the kind of the macroeconomics of spending trillions of dollars right now?
Well, first on the pandemic issue, it obviously set this whole thing off, and it still has its ugly face showing, because at the height of the pandemic, 40% of all Chinese factories were shut down. I mean, that was their reaction to the pandemic. And of course, they have still never recovered from that. Just last week in China, there was another outbreak, and they've shut down 4 or 5 of the major cities again this week. And so, those things have the ripple effect. So the pandemic impacts are certainly not over. The other big pandemic impact that we forget about is the problem of moving anything over national borders. That's why we're out of cardboard, is we're not able to get the paper pulp from Canada to turn into cardboard in the factories in the Northwest here, because it's really hard to get truckers back and forth across the border. And so national borders worldwide are creating a hurdle all their own. What we found was, pardon me, certain countries like ours were some of the first ones to say, you can't visit us from another country. And so everyone then retaliated and got to the point where business people couldn't go back and forth. And the next thing materials couldn't go back and forth across borders. That is finally starting to loosen up. You're actually now able to get visas, and hopefully that means that they will also loosen up shipping. That's one of the reasons we can't get raw materials out of China. So, out of Africa. It's just so that the whole border issue is 100% due to the pandemic and the politics of the pandemic. China is really the globalization issue. And again, the very fact that we've moved so many things there, the very first reaction that a lot of American corporations had to the pandemic was literally, that happened in March. By May, they were all looking to resource their stuff other places. So there's been a lot of manufacturing moving to Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines. But you can't move a supply chain for ONTs in less than a year or two. And so, so those things are actually going to come online here. And all of a sudden, we're going to start seeing a lot of those things fixed because we're not getting them from China anymore. But, that's not a quick fix. But I think companies took a quick look and said, I can't rely on the Chinese anymore. And we had all of our eggs in that one Chinese basket. That was really not a very smart global decision by the whole world, not just the United States. And so I think that's going to end up, moving manufacturing around. What I hope it does here is it drives us to start building factories again. We've talked about it. There is actually some money for that in an infrastructure bill to start bringing factories back here just to make regular stuff. And that would really help the supply chain. So let's hope that happens. Finally, the big global picture of the increase in demand. First off, we have a huge pent-up demand. My brother-in-law has a car dealership, and they get cars in and they're gone by 5 o'clock the same day. There is no such thing as an inventory of automobiles or trucks or anything else. And this is happening across the entire economy. And so, fiber guys can't make fiber fast enough. They have a huge backlog already. And that's true of almost everything in the chain. So forget how much that we're going to order next year, because of all these various stimulus programs. We can't satisfy the supply we already have because all these various accumulated problems have meant every single factory has a backlog. If nobody ordered anything new, I'm guessing it would take a half a year to just to deliver what we've already all ordered. So,
right.
Yeah.
Great additional points. Debbie, could you react to the point about sort of manufacturing in the United States and the kind of the Chinese role that might have kind of created the all eggs in one basket situation? What are your reactions to what Doug just said on that point?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think, part of, I'm hoping that part of the Build Back Better slogan is that we will look to have more manufacturing plants open here in the United States. And, unfortunately, the sort of setback to that is that, and I think why we sort of became a little bit more dependent, and I don't want to get into politics or anything like that, but I think why we became more dependent on, Chinese manufacturing is, some things when you buy in the United States, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. So, I'm kind of hoping that the expense sort of levels out, and we're already seeing what I mentioned before about the cost of materials and freight and shipping. You hear all the things about, to Doug's point about Amazon running out of cardboard boxes, and how long it takes to get things shipped to you. That those kind of things I think need to be ironed out.
Okay. So let's kind of drill in now a little bit more to the issues faced by the fiber industry. Again, cognizant that there's, great points that Doug just made about 6 months to kind of work our way through what's just been ordered, and we're now about to see a much larger rollout or roll through. But I want to ask and this goes to something Debbie said earlier, which is on materials and availability. And you said something about vendors can limit part numbers. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit? Oh, and thank you for these questions. I meant to encourage, please go ahead and put forward your questions in the chat window. We'll try to get to as many as I can. I also put a link in the chat window to our sponsors of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're very grateful for that support. So Debbie and Doug, could you elaborate on the part numbers issue?
Oh, so, a long time I used to, I think in my bio, it had that I was an analyst for Gartner. In a lot of cases, I noticed that, when you have a lot of products, with a lot of part numbers, it not only confuses, but it means that you have to keep that supply of certain things, on hand or on stock, and that you have to manufacture them. So, by minimizing the number of parts or, consolidating, your inventory or your offerings, your material offering, that could help reduce the time to market and time to get things shipped to your customers.
Well, how do you do that though? How does are we talking about a fiber manufacturer, or talking about a telecom equipment provider, an internet service provider? Who's going to be able to limit their part numbers?
It would be the vendors in the supply chain. So,
it's
the vendors. So for example, there's a lot of things that are probably being phased out. So it's a matter of getting, the new updated equipment or updated supplies of materials, on board. And, it's kind of like what AT&T was doing. A lot of what the homes that they were passing with the fiber were already ones that they were serviced. So what they were doing was they were essentially upgrading their customers. So it's, the same thing as like, when you're replacing copper with fiber or 5G.
Yeah, and I'm seeing the same thing, Drew, because what you used to be able to do, let's just use the example of fiber pigtails. That's a device that you put in
fiber pigtails.
Pigtails. That's a little assembly that you use when you sort of bring two fibers together and also want to go out to the neighborhood. So it has all these various splice points. It has the access points for customers, and they used to come in just a gigantic wide array of different configurations, different lengths, and different number of fibers and different number of connectors. And I think what the manufacturer is doing is going to come back and say, look, we're making 6 of them. You make that work in your design. And so because they can make, the fiber guys, even 2 years ago, would make you all sorts of any weird kind of fiber. You wanted a 50 pair fiber, they would have quote you a price for it and make it. But that means they had to stop the assembly line for at least a half an hour to put this new kind of size fiber out. They won't do that anymore. So the custom stuff is out the door. They're going to make 12, 24, 48, 98, 144 pair of fibers and go, if you don't want that, then go find it somewhere else. And so that's one way for them to probably get 10% more efficient. And so the same way I think you're going to see for the equipment makers. The problem is if in the electronics world, if you have something older, you need that weird part because you have what you have, right? You can't take a replacement that's something different. So it's going to get to be that's just one more thing it'll be very hard to get. We're already seeing, there's a gigantic, I call it a gray market on eBay. That's where people are finding the weird stuff anymore. Like people will buy a used anything in the telecom world. You put a router out there and it's gone in 10 minutes. It's like, that's not exactly what I wanted, but I'll make it work, right? So, yeah.
Well, let me go to another point that I believe Debbie made earlier, but I think you echoed it too, Doug, which is if you aren't going to have, if it's the small guys that are not gonna get the polite brush off. Oh yeah, 2 years. We'll get it for you in 2 years. What does that mean? What does that mean for broadband projects? Is that kind of incentivized consolidations or partnerships, or I mean, what are kind of the intelligence, Debbie, that you're hearing in within the Fiber Broadband Association and the fiber industry, and likewise for you, Doug, what are people talking about solutions to overcome that? Hey, we can't deal with you; you're too small.
Yeah, that could run two ways, right? So you could go to a non-traditional supplier who might have earlier availability for parts or whatever. But you also want to work with the long-term proven vendors that have a higher reliability and better support. So I think that's it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want the materials, but you also might not have the customer support that you would get from an established vendor that has long-term expertise in this particular area.
Yeah, and that also translates, Drew, into some really weird situations. There's a there's a fiber manufacturing plant in Mexico that makes fiber for Mexico and South America, and it's mostly, I call it warm weather fiber. It's not as heavy of sheaths; it just doesn't have to be, and so you can't buy that fiber and put it in Minnesota. You can't put that and put it in a place where there's going to be heavy winds knocking the wire around, and so so people are getting substitutes, but the substitutes are not necessarily equal. But but when there's a shortage, you grab what you can find, because especially if you're an unsophisticated buyer like a small city, you don't know the difference between all these kinds of fiber, which leads to maybe the most important. Now this is me speaking. The most important shortage of all is there's a shortage of experts to help these folks. I mean, consultants and engineers are already fully booked, and I don't know about other consultants, but I'm turning away more work than I'm accepting. And I know that I know a whole lot of engineers who are in the same position. You can't even get started to build a fiber project if somebody can't design it for you. And so the little guys, I don't know what their solution is, Drew, because it doesn't do any good to partner if your partner can't get this stuff either. What I think is going to happen is the people giving out these grants, being the various government agencies, are going to have to, if they have a 2-year build, they might have to relax it to a 4 or 5-year build. It'll all eventually get built, but if they stick to those timelines, projects are going to fall on the floor, and then they just don't get built at all, and the money just returns back to the federal coffers. So I think if they don't extend the timelines, if they extend the timelines long enough, everything will eventually get built. All these projects people want to do, they know what they want to do, but they can't all be done in the next 2 or 3 years. It's absolutely impossible to build all the stuff that's on the table. It's just that there is no possible world. Last point to make there is, we can't pick up manufacturing for a lot of this. Fiber factories are actually already working at more than capacity, and they're not likely to build new fiber factories. It's a 3 to 4 year process to start from scratch to build a new fiber factory. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar investment, and you're only going to do that if you think it's going to make money for 20 or 30 years. And they look out and they think that 5 years from now it might not be in such great demand again. So I'm not sure that the Corning's going to build 5 new factories. They may not build any. So and so they already had some in the chain. There's several new factories coming on board this coming year, but I don't know that they're going to build any more of them. I think the world might just have to wait for them. So
yeah, you have a question?
Yeah.
So sorry, we've got a question here from David McCartney. We encourage others to ask your questions of Debbie Kish and Doug Dawson. Question: how much of the current supply chain issue is a result of players trying to stock up today so they don't have any issue for 2022? This is kind of like, when the pandemic first hit, there was like a shortage of toilet paper, right? I mean, because people were hoarding toilet paper. Like, so what is what's going on there, first off, and what do we do about it?
There's some small amounts of that going on, but there's not a lot of it. I mean, you can make a lot of money right now by just sitting on ONTs and waiting 6 months, but there's not a whole lot of that because the vendors aren't giving them that. I hear a story here and there, but I don't think there's, those folks can't get the stuff either. So, I mean, I had several clients who actually had a stockpile from pre-pandemic and have sold it off because it was better to get money for it than to keep it sitting in inventory. So I really don't think that's a major issue. That's the black market issue. It might be 1 or 2% of the market. It's not a big player. So
yeah, I would have to echo that and say, I don't see any real stockpiling happening. I think for the most part, anybody who's got a project that they want to get done, they just keep them rolling out and hope for the best for materials to present themselves.
Okay. So let's talk a little about the time frames again, and again, kind of, we've been talking obviously at Broadband Breakfast for many years, and even in this series, since we've been doing since the start of pandemic, we've had a number of sessions on Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That was kind of last year's belle of the ball, right? I mean, and that still exists. There's still going to be a second round of RDOF, but who knows when is sort of an open question. And a lot of attention right now, of course, is focused on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the $65 billion I spoke about. So let's drill down a little bit more into this, the timing here. Now I'm going to take us on a slight detour. When the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was planned and rolled out, there was a lot of focus on immediate, right away, get the projects going. I mean, almost like a pure economic stimulus approach. And I'm hearing a little bit less of that right now, in part because the economy is in a different state than it was then, kind of just, objectively, employment numbers and so forth. But also because, there is this acknowledgement, I think, Doug, that there's literally no way that you can spend $65 billion in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. So let's talk just how much can we spend per year on fiber deployments. I'd actually, just that simple question, Debbie and Doug, what are your thoughts on that? How fast can we build fiber?
Oh, well, so let me touch a little bit on the money side. So, it's not only been RDOF, but, post-COVID, there has been ARPA money, ARPA money that's been granted to each state. So there's been a state level fiscal recovery funding from ARPA. And then on top of that, in addition to that's something like $193 billion that's out to the states. And then on top of that, there's
not
ARPA,
all for broadband, of course.
Not all for broadband, but there are some, you see California, they've got $6 billion in funding for broadband as part of, what they're using their ARPA money for. And then there's the ARPA Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund that each state also, has as well. So there's probably, maybe so far I've seen maybe over a dozen or so states that have allocated, say Tennessee is $500 million, or I'm sorry, $400 million to boosting accessibility, and 96 million that will go towards increasing service adoption. Virginia has $700 million in ARPA fund that's going to broadband deployments, with their goal is achieving universal coverage by 2024. So there's kind of a time frame. I think all the states have a goal in mind. Whether or not they're going to meet that goal, remains to be seen. Fiber in general, I think one of the things that's going to hold back, and what I talked about a little bit before in the beginning, was the labor shortage. These guys don't have, they'll get the money, but I don't really see spending happening until, because look at the infrastructure bill so far, we have not yet, it's not decided on. So when that does get decided, I'm guessing probably somewhere late 2022, maybe 2023. And I know of some states that have some grants that they are having ISPs apply for, and they're hoping to disperse the money or award the money, in the first quarter of 2022, with spending and deployments hopefully happening, soon thereafter. And it's an ambitious goal, but I don't really foresee a lot of the spending happening until, and the real deployments. And then you've got the supply chain. It's just this whole litany of things that just keep piling on, that I think are hampering the movement of deploying fiber.
Let me just clarify something you said. When you said 2022, 2023, were you talking about, not the passage by Congress, right? Or were you were talking about the implementation, or could you just?
Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about, is the actual implementation and the installs, when they start moving these projects forward. Because it's going to take time before, before the money gets dispersed. And each state has to, they've all been in talks about, how they're going to spend it. The ones that I rhymed off before. So I don't actually see anything really happening for at least another half year.
Okay. And again, I'm not hearing that that's terrible. In fact, I think you're saying that it's just natural and needed that there's some time. But let me just push you on how much can the fiber economy take, right? Like what's an estimate for the amount of billions of dollars that can reasonably be spent building fiber in a year's time?
Oh gosh, I don't have an. I don't have.
That's a tough lift. I know.
That is a tough one, because, like I said, some of the things that you have to, look at as part of the contributing factors to it is the increase in material costs. So, that could be. I really have no. I don't have a number in mind out of that. Carving it out. I don't know. Maybe Doug does.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to put a number to it either, but here's what we do know. The fiber industry was already, it wasn't at 100% capacity, but it was starting to fill it up even before the pandemic. Verizon says they're building fiber to the curb past 25 million homes. AT&T has been trying to be passing 2 to 3 million homes a year. And so these folks were already using a lot of the fiber capacity. In the last year, all of a sudden, we have Windstream and Frontier, and you just go down the line of all the big companies saying they're going to pass, 400,000 or 500,000, 600,000 homes per year, consolidated just up and down the line. And then that's before any of these programs. Those folks already completely filled up the industry chain with their goals, and they're the big corporate buyers. They go to the front of the supply chain line. And so, you're not going to say no to Frontier compared to some little city project if they really want to buy a whole bunch of fiber. And so that's full. I've always heard numbers in the range of, because it was always hard to know how much of the big company infrastructure spending went for what, because the 2 of the 3 big spenders were Verizon and AT&T, and we have no idea what they spend their money on because they also have wireless. And so, we don't know what their actual budgets go for. But, I think the historic chain was in the range of $10 to $15 billion a year, somewhere in the fiber industry. Maybe it steps up to 20 billion a year. Well, we probably have 100 billion to spend. So if that's the case, that's 5 years right there. That's the real, and that's without the inflation. Inflation will mean the $100 billion turns into 140 billion by the time you actually get it in the ground, but it's the same amount of construction. So there's no way that we can absorb all this coming money. It's just none of the parts of the supply chain are ready. The electronics guys can't do it. The fiber guys can't do it. The construction crews can't do it. And the consultants and engineers can't do it. So I don't know how they get it done. So.
Well, I want to get you both thinking about this question of what are some solutions, right? We've talked a lot about problems, and I'm not saying we can wave a magic wand and make them go away, but I definitely want to get your thoughts on how to make things better. Maybe we can come back to that fiber certification program, Debbie, that you talked about earlier. I just want to point out, and I put this in the chat window for those who are logged on Zoom, but of course we stream this live. It's also available on Broadband Breakfast, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook. We have had a number of events, and we'll continue to have events on topics related to the infrastructure build out. One we had just 2 weeks ago was on broadband.money, a new service that enables people who are applying for broadband funds to basically matchmake with others, with funders, and to submit applications. So that's a new tool available for folks. Another one we had about 4 or 5 weeks ago was on the issue of best practices for delivering rural networks. And we talked a lot about the way that digital assets can help simplify rollout, particularly digital design and rendering of assets in the planning, engineering, and construction phases. And then we had another discussion. This is the final one that I put in the chat window, that we have more than these, is what's next for broadband infrastructure legislation. This was 2 months ago, September 1st. We had Gary Bolton of Fiber Broadband Association, as well as several other major industry players, talking about, now that the bill, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has passed the Senate, when will it pass the House? Obviously, 2 months later, we're still waiting. But that's wrapped up in a broader question that we don't need to go into right now. So anyway, I just want to point you to these resources that are available on these topics. And so now let's come back to, what are some solutions that Debbie and Doug, you feel you have, or that can get us to ways to at least manage the complexity of supply chain issues?
So, kind of going back to what I had talked about before, and like I said, it's really based largely on what we hear from our service provider and member base. And I think that we need to have more bodies in the workforce. That I think, of course, but how do you solve the supply chain issue, which I'll probably let Doug speak to, but besides more manufacturing plants, in the United States, made in the United States, those kind of things. But, definitely there's a big workforce problem. And, like I mentioned before, one of the ways that, we're trying to help that and solve that is through our fiber optic certification course. And of course, if anybody has any questions about that, like I said, I've been working with, vocational community colleges, veterans programs, and we're reaching out to high schools as early as the 9th grade. So we're trying to attract, a wide, diverse audience of people who would, look to this kind of industry for a career. And, it helps build economies and things of that nature.
Debbie, we kind of persistently hear problems about, the education system is not sort of producing the people with the skills that we need in the tech industry. That's kind of a refrain I've heard for decades now. Is this kind of another version of that, or is this a slightly different take on it? What is the Fiber Broadband Association's reaction to the issue of skills and skills development?
So we recognize that there's a lot of fiber optic technician courses out there. And as a matter of fact, we offer a couple of certifications through Light Brigade. There's an outside plant, can't think of it, the exact term of what it is at this point, but also a certified fiber to the home professional certification as well. And they're all good courses. But we found that a lot of what's available out there right now are a mile wide and an inch deep. So this particular course goes deeper into fiber theory. It teaches the students about fiber attenuation, and then there's a hands-on portion. They'll be hands-on throughout the entire course, but it's fiber splicing, it's also test and measurement, and it covers a vast variety of all things that have to do with deploying fiber to the home.
Okay. Doug, some of your reactions on the skills question.
First off, none of us can solve the big problem. So I think a lot of those, except for the actual availability of fiber, will solve themselves. Electronics and all this stuff will be worked out. I can only look out for my clients. And so what I am recommending is that we look at the micro level, because what we have found is that most of the people who build fiber travel a lot of the year. I mean, that's just a fact of life, right? Those guys, it's really not a very fun job. If you build fiber, you end up living on the road for 48 weeks a year. And it turns out that these folks are from everywhere. And so one of the solutions that I already have clients looking into is to talk to local engineer or construction firms and go, look, if I can give you guaranteed work for 2 years, you can stay in your house. We're having this big project coming here. You don't have to go 2 states over to work for 2 years. How about you stay here and work out of your house? And so I think that part of the solution is to attract local talent, and that's always best for the community anyhow, and keep the work there. At the same time, what my small clients are doing is those training courses are absolutely needed that Debbie's talking about. But, we can do it the old-fashioned way too, which is apprenticeship programs. So a lot of my clients are taking on brand new off-the-street guys, and they're not having any problem finding them. I think that we don't have that shortage of those kind of folks. They just never thought about this as a thing to do for a living before. But when you start waving $60,000, $70,000 salaries at them 3 years later, they go, wait a minute, that's probably better than doing what I already had in mind. And so I think, so they're really attracting a lot of really good young folks to this idea. But so I think the second approach is if you can't get your folks, or if there's not one of these training courses in your state or your part of the state, hire the guys as apprentices, put them out with your guys, start doing some of your own construction. I have a whole lot of clients who are building 2- and 3-man construction teams, so at least they can get something done. What I think is going to happen is labor will be the choke force. If you have the people and you can build, you're going to get the fiber. And so, the guys who can't get any contractors hired, no one's going to give them the fiber because, you won't order a second round of it. So I think taking care of labor first is actually the best way to go, because if you have that, you'll find the fiber, I believe. So,
well, and the way Debbie laid it out earlier with, the 3 issues: materials, labor, and cost. I mean, cost is basically just your mechanism for equalizing the forces here, right? I mean, obviously, we can get more labor if we pay more wages, right? Pay more in wages, right? And you've just articulated that a little bit. And I mean, look, cost is going to be a factor. You've laid that out. 100 billion may end up costing 140 billion. You just said, Doug, and that's just kind of a fact of life, so to speak, and not really anything that can be done about it. But maybe kind of my closeout question is: so what other things or thoughts do each of you have that you'd like to bring to bear to this discussion? Let's broaden out beyond just the supply chain, but concrete issues in the deployment of broadband, particularly fiber broadband. What are some of Debbie, your thoughts on this as we kind of round towards a conclusion here?
So one thing that we've seen at our Fiber Connect 2021 show back in July, we had a whole segment on public-private partnerships. So we've been seeing a lot of, co-ops that are, getting into the fiber game and offering. As a matter of fact, I've been working with my electric co-op here in my own county of Franklin, North Carolina, to try and get them to offer fiber to the home in the county. So, I think that maybe exploring those options, public-private partnerships, and, also take a look at your individual states and see what programs and grants there are available. There's in talking to a lot of the schools and the departments of labor across the United States, just in these last few months, I've learned a lot about, what individual states are doing and, what they have available. So those are a couple of initial thoughts.
By the way, I live in North Carolina too, Debbie. We got to figure this out one of these days. The advice I give folks is do a true assessment of your own local situation and get very realistic on what you can and can't get done. I think some of the problems we see is people being very aggressive and trying to chew off really large projects. It's like, you're not going to get that large project done. Why don't you tackle it in 3 phases? Because by the time we get to the 3rd phase, maybe the supply chain will be back to normal again. So I think that having a realistic expectation, hearing all the stuff we said today, and we're only saying the stuff that everyone else is saying too. I mean, this shouldn't be news to anybody. And so get realistic and tackle something that you really can be done. Do it 1 year at a time. What can I get done next year with all these issues on the table? And that way, at least you're doing something. Don't tackle a project that's so large that you end up doing nothing if instead you can do 3 smaller projects and get the same thing done. So that's the approach that I'm pushing folks for. So.
All right. Well, I'm going to have about 2 minutes here, summing up and a couple of sort of announcements, if you will. But if anyone has more questions, we do have just a few more minutes. That no need to linger on if we don't have things to say. But it's been great to get these observations, even if it isn't news, Doug. I think it's great to have experts like yourself, Debbie, and Doug to talk about this concrete issue. I do want to remind everyone that we appreciate the support of our sponsors. Our sponsors are Broadband.money, Broadband Now, California Emerging Technology Fund, Lit Communities, Positron Access, Powerhouse Management, Render Networks, Samsung Electronics America, and Utopia Fiber. We appreciate their support, which enables us to do programs like this. Speaking of which, we are going to be talking next week about the issue of Section 230 and social media, and how some of the recent developments and controversies around Facebook are going to impact the debate around social media. So tune in next Wednesday at 12 noon for that. And the following week, we're planning to do how the telecom and tech industry should approach privacy, which continues, again, to be a big issue, very much part of the fabric of discussion of everyday folks of privacy, and yet how the tech and telecom industries react to it. We have a program, I sent it earlier in the link that you can see our upcoming events. I also want to just say, hey, we look forward to your thoughts and your feedback. Those of you who are watching here, either on Zoom or other platforms, please feel free to email me. I'm putting my email in the chat window, but I'll tell it for everyone, drew@breakfast.media, if you have a particular thought, suggestion, question. And we also, last point, we also have been doing in-person events. We launched one on September 8th with a great discussion at Clyde's of Gallery Place. That's the same place we were at years ago, and we've returned there, but we are continuing to do them live online. And so we are going to continue to do this session, 12 noon Eastern time, but we look forward to meeting again in person, and really, again, encourage your thoughts and feedback on topics that we should focus on when we meet in person. Well, with that, we've talked quite a bit. Debbie, Doug, any last thoughts you'd like to share before we close out?
Other than, I just kind of wanted to point out, I think I wasn't very forthcoming with information at the Fiber Broadband Association. We have an entire library of information, surveys, and research white papers that have been written by our technology committee, some homegrown information studies on workforce development that, if anybody's interested in, please feel free to contact me, and, I'd be happy to share some information, whether it's the research or on the optic technician course.
And on the page, again, I just put it in the chat stream, the page for this event where this video will live, we have links to some of the materials you sent me, Debbie. We're happy to put more in as well, but that's a great reference point for people. Yeah. Doug, let's give you the final word.
My final word was, as usual, Drew, you asked really good questions. So I thought this was a pretty good discussion. You keep us moving along, and you don't let us get too lazy in our answers.
Well said.
Glad to have you back, Doug. And thank you all on behalf of Debbie Kish and Doug Dawson. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time.